right, I'm really excited with our next guest. We have Dr. Michelle Macroy-Higgins here. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Hi, Craig. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. No, thanks for doing this. I'm really excited to talk about late talkers, which is a very hot topic, not only for speech language pathologists, but I think also for parents as well, or you can say grandparents, or if you have a niece or a nephew, because it's really about childhood development. Now, before we get into the topic of late talkers, please let the audience know who you are and your training and everything else about where you basically from grad school and on about your tell us about your career.
Okay, so Craig said my name is Michelle Macroy-Higgins. I am a speech language pathologist or a speech language therapist, and so I received my master's degree from Adelphi University, and I have a Ph.D. in speech language and hearing sciences from the Graduate Center, which is part of the City University of New York. And currently I'm an associate professor at Hunter College, which is also part of the City University of New York. And I've worked as a speech language pathologist for over 20 years, and I've really focused on the toddler and preschool population. That's what we're going to talk about today. And I have my research is also focused specifically on late talkers.
That's awesome. Now, I just have a bunch of questions for you, and this stuff, a lot of stuff I know, but it's important, to let the audience know about this as well. So, when you graduated with your master's, and then you started doing clinical training as a speech language pathologist, can you just tell us a little bit more about your clinical experiences before or during when you were getting your doctorate?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So a speech language pathologist or a speech therapist, once they graduate with their master's degree, they do something that's called a clinical fellowship year. So that's kind of like a residency that a medical doctor does, where you're a speech language therapist, you are working under the supervision of another therapist, and then after that, you're a certified and licensed professional. And so
I'm going to jump in. So let's say there's someone watching this, they want to be a speech language pathologist. So for the most part in New York State, and obviously states differ a little bit, it sounds like you have to get a master's degree, which means you have to have the prerequisites. So if you don't have the prerequisites, it can be 3 full years as a master's. And then once you get your master's, then you have a 9-month fellowship, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And your fellowship is like your first job. You get paid for your fellowship, and you're working, most of the time full-time. You could do your fellowship on a part-time basis as well. So I did my fellowship at a preschool for kids with special needs in Queens, and I stayed working there for many, many years after. I didn't want to leave. It was my favorite population. Mm-hmm. And at that preschool, it's called HeartShare. We had about 13 different classrooms. All kids were either toddlers as young as 1.5 up to about 5 years of age. And we had kids with all different types of communication difficulties.
That's great. So then in our field, the minority of professionals, once they get their master's and they get some clinical training, very few go on to get a PhD, right?
That is true.
So why did you decide to pursue a doctorate?
So when I was a graduate student, I was given a scholarship where part of my tuition was paid, and I had to work with a faculty person on their research. So I got really, really engaged with research when I was a graduate student. And the topic was not necessarily something that I decided to pursue later on, but just the idea of doing research, presenting your research at different professional events, and also making that jump between research and clinical application was really exciting to me when I was a graduate student. And then I finished my master's degree. I pursued my clinical fellowship year with the population that I really wanted to work with. But I realized the more I worked with this population, toddlers and preschoolers, the more I realized I didn't really know. And we need to do research really to find out how to best work with this population. And so we
could totally jump in. So one thing I admire about you, and it's really hard to find professionals like you, particularly in our field, is that you get a lot of professionals, the majority of professionals, they get their masters and they don't pursue a doctor, right? Then you have the ones that do pursue a doctor, and a lot of them don't really have the clinical training. Maybe they went straight into their PhD program. There's also obviously professionals in our field that were not, maybe they were trained in engineering or other areas, and then they pursue speech pathology. Now, you have both. You have the clinical experience, the research, and teaching as well. So you're also teaching undergrads and grads, right, at Hunter?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I have the best job because I get to do all those things.
Yeah.
I get to work with toddlers, working on increasing their communication. I get to work with graduate students and helping them, learn how to be a speech language pathologist. I get to do research where I get to tie in all those things. I get to work with graduate students on their research. So I think I've got the best job.
Yeah, no, so you have all those perspectives, and that's why, so the topic, which we're going to discuss, is late talkers, right? So for people that obviously they hear the term late talkers, right, they know what that means, but from a scientific perspective, what is a late talker?
Right. So a late talker is defined as a 2-year-old, so a 24-month-old, who is saying fewer than 50 words and is not yet combining words into short sentences. So just as a point of comparison, babies will start to say words around their first birthday, and then they'll gradually add more and more words to their vocabularies. Around a year and a half or so, they'll start to combine words into short sentences like more milk. And then by about 24 months, typically developing toddlers will have about 200 to 300 words that they say. So a late talker is a little bit behind in those milestones. They may not necessarily start to say their first word around their first birthday, and by the time they're 2, they have some words, but they don't have as many as a child who's not a late talker.
So the research really focuses at the 24-month mark. Why 24 months? Like, why not 18 months? Why not 30 months? What's so special about 24 months?
What's so special? So there is a huge range of what we observe in typically developing kids. And I think that, 2 is an age in which we would expect them to have at least a certain amount of words. 50, so we can give kids up until that age to get going with their language. And some kids do get a little bit of a late start, but then once they start saying words, they really are able to add a lot of words to their vocabularies. So at 18 months, if a toddler still only has, a handful of words, maybe like 10 or 20 words, we're not quite concerned at that point. But 2, it seems like we're able to identify kids at that age who might be at risk.
Yeah, and the other thing also, just from like a clinical perspective, like, so parents, it could be arbitrary for them if my child's 22 months, 23, 24 months, but as speech language pathologists, when we're doing assessments, the norms, right, at 23 to 24 months could be completely different, right? So you can have the same child you see at 23 months, and if the child you see a month later is not significantly different, and if they're really behind at 23 months, then they're could be really behind at 24 months. So parents also, right, they have to also realize just how these norms are kind of set, and then the expectations could really change dramatically. Now, so in terms of a late talker, does that term just imply they're late and they will catch up?
That's a great question, and that's what everyone wants to know the answer
to.
So who cares if they got a late start? Doesn't really matter.
And parents have the story, like, oh, my when I was growing up, my brother was a late talker. He didn't talk until he was 3, or my parent or my uncle. So, Einstein or whatever, you always hear about these stories where these, so-and-so didn't speak, and then they're brilliant, they're doing well. So therefore, right, if my child at 24 months is a late talker, like, what's the big deal?
Right. So it is important to understand if any child is delayed, because the majority of late talkers, about 75%, by the time they go to kindergarten, really show no difference as compared to their peers in terms of language. But those kids are a little bit at risk for their ability to acquire reading and literacy skills, because we do know that the foundation for learning how to read is actually our oral language, our talking. So if a kid gets a little bit of a late start to communication, to talking, to their vocabulary, they don't quite have the same foundation as their peers who didn't have a delay. And that's about 75% of late talkers. So what about the other 25% of those kids? So about 25% of kids who are late talkers are later diagnosed with language impairment. So language impairment means that a child has a specific difficulty learning language. So they really struggle more with communicating using sentences and using grammar forms and things like that. And those kids do struggle more in school.
So just for the audience to know, so language impairment, it's a research term. And then for parents that want to, I mean, parents are not going to obviously want to read the research on language impairment, but an informal, this is not a formal definition, would be like a language-based learning issues, would be like another term in a way. So what you're talking about is really important. So what you're trying to say is that there's a speech to print connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then even when a child is young and is not expected to read or learn literacy, there could be predictors way before they're supposed to learn literacy, right? That could possibly let you or the parent or whoever know that they may be at risk at some point for acquiring literacy.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's fascinating, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thinking about your child who's 2, being able to understand how what you're doing at home with your child really could positively influence their, experience in kindergarten and first grade.
So let's say you're, whether you're a parent, as I said, a relative, whatever, and you have a little one, right? A 1-year-old, 2-year-old, way before they're going to be in kindergarten. So even though this is not the topic of the conversation, what you're trying to also say is that parental input can actually play a huge role in how the child later acquires literacy, right? So this isn't just specific to late talkers, right?
Not necessarily, no. So we do know that the more input a child hears and the quality of the input, the more language a child hears and interacts with other individuals, the stronger their language skills are later on. And so we do know that there's a relationship between language and literacy.
So let's say, okay, so this all makes sense. Now, what about let's get international, right? Like, how does this apply to bilingual, multilingual children that are growing up in more than one, in an environment where they hear more than one language? What about internationally? I mean, does this phenomenon exist in other languages? Like, as a human species, tell me more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't matter what language you are listening to, the more of that language, the better. And the more languages you can expose your child to, the better. There used to be this idea that more than one language might be confusing for a young child, or if a child is having difficulty with a particular language, we shouldn't introduce another language. But research really shows us that that's not true at all, that the child should learn and be exposed to the language that their community and their home is speaking. So there are many benefits we've learned about the having more than one language.
So let's say you're concerned about a child, and the child, say is 24 months, or maybe has some language delays, vocabulary delays at 18 months compared to peers, or at 3 years the child's not speaking as much as peers. What can a parent do?
Right. So usually the first stop is a parent might discuss their concerns with their pediatrician. And that's a good place to start. The pediatrician would be able to provide some basic information about language and language milestones. But I would say that the professional that the parent should really reach out to is a speech-language pathologist, or a speech therapist is another term that you might be familiar with. And I'm going
to jump in and be very blunt, is that even we're in Brooklyn, but even within Brooklyn, there's a lot of variability with pediatricians in terms of what they determine might be a possible, speech language delay. And pediatricians, from what I hear, they've taken, like, in terms of speech language development, they took maybe an hour, 2 hours worth of coursework to cover speech language development. So I'm not knocking on pediatricians, but they're not speech language specialists, right? Their jobs are more medically
Correct.
based. And as you're saying, to piggyback, of course, everyone, you want to respect your pediatrician, but personally, we've had families that pediatricians said, just wait and see, wait and see, wait and see. And it's okay to say, you know what, maybe I should get a second opinion by someone who does specialize in this, just to see what what that speech language pathologist or speech language therapist says, right?
Right. Absolutely. And depending on the age of your child, then you might seek help different ways. And so all
Mm-hmm.
states have birth to three programs where you can contact the birth to three program. And in New York State, it's called early intervention, where you can request an evaluation. If your child is 3 or older, you would go through your school system. That's one way to go. Another way to go is to contact a private practitioner,
Mm-hmm.
someone who does private practice. They might be in an office, or they might travel to your home. Another idea is to look at university clinics. So a university that has a graduate program in speech language pathology is likely to have a clinic where they see clients and do evaluations for little kids. So there's
So
lots of different ways.
So let's say I'm a parent and my child has been identified as having a significant language delay, is labeled late talker, has significant speech language issues. What should I expect if I decide to work with a speech language therapist or speech language pathologist? And my child is young, like,
Right.
2 years, 3 years old.
Exactly. So the first thing that would happen would be an evaluation where the speech language pathologist would come in and observe the child's language, how much they understand language, what are they saying, and other ways that they're using to communicate, like using gestures and pointing. And the evaluation will help the speech language pathologist know the best way to provide treatment for that child.
So it sounds like a speech language therapist is trying to assess, like, the baseline function, and there's different types of. I mean, people think, like, oh, like, come in, like, you can hear my child speak, or if my child's not speaking, like, the assessment should take 2 minutes, but it's a lot more in depth. There's a lot of things that we look at, right, when we do the assessment.
Absolutely. And especially for a very young child, the assessment is likely to take place in the home environment so that the speech language pathologist can observe the child. How do they communicate with the family, with the caregivers, and then what types of supports are available from the family to the child. So we really look at the environment, we look at development, we look at play skills, how the child interacts with toys.
So I'm happy you mentioned play, and I don't want to, because that could be a whole separate topic. But why play? Why would a speech language therapist or speech language pathologist look at how the child plays? What does that have to do with how the child communicates?
Right, that's a great question, and it's not real obvious
Right.
until you think it through. So, as adults, we learn by reading and we learn by taking in new information, but how very young kids learn is through play. They explore things around them, they do problem solving, they're trying to put two things together that aren't working and building. So, by observing how a child plays and interacts with toys, it really gives us information about how they are interpreting information around them, how they're integrating, and then also play provides the context for language. So we can
Mm-hmm.
talk about the trains, and we can talk about the blocks, and we can talk about the things that the child is engaged with.
Right. Yeah. And once parents become more aware of these things, they realize that it's multi-layered. It's not like if you're trying to teach a child language, it's not like teaching a parrot how to speak, like like probably want a cracker, and the parrot says probably want a cracker. There's meaning behind it, right? So just because a child can imitate certain sounds or words doesn't mean they're necessarily competent in terms of what they're saying, right? Now, okay, so in terms of I'm a parent, I hire a speech language therapist. Now, does this stuff actually help a child? Like, what do we know? Like, is it what? So let's say I find a great speech language therapist who connects with my child, connects with my family. I learn a lot of strategies. How and then in terms of progress, like what should I expect?
Right. So there is a little bit of research that supports providing therapy for this specific population. So there's a couple of different ideas. One idea is wait and see,
Mm-hmm.
and another idea is get started right away with intervention. And so there's so a small amount of research, but it does show that if you provide intervention right away, the kids who were in the intervention group showed greater gains as
Mm-hmm.
compared to the wait and see group.
Mm-hmm.
So the wait and see group, they did get better. So
Mm-hmm.
kids will learn new words, they'll learn new things on their own just because of development. But if they are able to work with a specialist, it seems like those gains are quicker. Right.
Yeah, and I find from experience the beautiful thing about what we do, and it varies obviously based on family by family, is that it increases the parent's awareness in terms of how they're interacting with their children, how they can make small changes, can make big differences, and also with the child, how the child interacts with others. And even young children, they become aware of certain ways they're communicating, or they may have those aha moments. And even though they're young, those small changes can have prolific. Again, everyone's different. I'm not saying this happens with every family, every child, but it's almost like you're, as a speech language therapist, when you're working with a child, with a family at their home in their natural environment. It's raising awareness, and sometimes these small tweaks, which can have pretty big impact on how that child is acquiring language. And really, as you said, if they're getting that intervention, how they can step on that accelerator, right?
Yeah.
Now, I know you came out with a book about late talkers a few years back, and it's called Time to Talk. Can you tell us more about that book?
Right. So the book came out in 2017, a couple years ago, and it's really meant to be a resource to parents, caregivers, teachers, even speech language pathologists. And it really outlines basic developmental information about speech, about language. It talks about some specific topics like reading and bilingualism. And my co-author, Carlin Kolker, is a writer. And so we were able to combine the knowledge that I've been able to gain as a speech language pathologist and a researcher, and it's presented in a very parent-friendly way. It's very digestible, and that is something that I observed, that there wasn't a real great resource out there for parents to be able to read and understand. There's so much information out there that it's hard to find something that's real simple but well written. So I think that we were able to accomplish that.
Yeah, no, and I will have a link below for those that are interested in checking out Michelle's book. It's on Amazon, and it is, as Michelle said, it's a great resource for whether it's a speech language pathologist, whether it's a parent, and there's to take the research and the actual real life practice and to make it parent friendly. It's it's a huge accomplishment. It's something that was much needed, and you filled that gap. So we, as speech language pathologists, we thank you. And if I'm a parent and let's say I just want to learn more about late talkers in general, and I can include those links at the bottom, what do you recommend?
So I would recommend looking at the American Speech Language Hearing Association website. The acronym is ASHA. That is our national accrediting body, and I believe that there are a lot of really good resources about early development, language in general, that parents would find very helpful.
Great. And I'll do that. I'll dig a little deeper and I'll find those links for parents. So Dr. Michelle, thank you so much for coming and discussing late talking and in the field of speech language therapy as well. And yeah, we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Craig.
Okay. Bye, Michelle. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.